Hi, this is John. Today I'm going to show you how to properly cut fiberglass in preparation for reinforcing a tube, fin, or anything else that we'd like to provide a hard, strong surface to. Rolled fiberglass cloth comes in like this from whomever you buy it. So usually it's protected and stored on a cardboard roll. We generally want to keep it stored on a roll like this and hung horizontally. If possible, if you can hang it from rods like this so it maintains this shape and doesn't distort. Anyway, here we have our sheet. This is 4-ounce E-glass fiberglass fabric. So first thing we do with our fiberglass, prepare a clean surface, and we're going to roll out our roll. And we're going to prepare the first clean edge. Usually what happens is when you get the roll, the edge is very ragged, or sometimes if you're in a hurry, when you cut the prior piece off, you left the edge ragged. So our first thing to do is get the front edge square. So in this case, I was pretty good about putting it away, but when you get a new roll, it'll be very ragged. So what we notice here is that the two edges, which are actually sealed with a special stitch, usually are in good shape. But the cut edge is just impossible to maintain perfectly, and you'll pretty much have to groom it each time. The other thing you'll notice is as you roll it, inevitably there's waves, so we're going to need to straighten that out. So the first thing we want to do is on the cut raw edge of the fabric is we want to get a straight line across with one of the toes. This is plain weave fabric, so the fibers are woven at 90 degrees, so it's relatively easy to get it squared up. We know these edges are squared because they're maintained by the stitching, and we know that the toes that run perpendicular should be squared up to get the piece. So what we'll do is we'll find loose toes here, like this, and we'll keep pulling the edges until we get a toe that comes off all the way along. So what we're doing here is just removing the little bits from the last time we cut that aren't consistently all the way across. Now this may take a while if your fabric was cut last time without having been squared up, but eventually you'll get to a toe that comes all the way across. Now we have an end along here. Okay, so to get a square piece, we have to line up this edge. We know we have one consistent toe on the edge because we pulled all the scraps out, so we lay a rule down. I like these nice long rules, it's easy to work with. It's not critical that we get this at a 90-degree angle, but it is important that we get a relatively straight line on the edge. And the reason for that is, if we just measured and cut, we would have this wavy pattern that would cross toes, and we'd have a bunch of little threads coming out when we're trying to work with it, and it's just a pain in the ass. So anyway, what we're going to do is use this rule to create a straight edge. And to do that, we can just manipulate the fiberglass. See how I can stretch it slowly and carefully and pull this in. If you have a larger amount to do, you can grasp the edges, create a ridge, and use that to pull. So what we're going to do is square up this last toe to the edge of the rule and create a nice even edge of our cut. You can pull both ways clearly, but it's more difficult to pull on the edge because it will tend to fray the fabric. So it's easier to use friction to pull on the fabric end. Once we have the edge squared up, we want to smooth out the fabric for at least the length that we're going to cut off the roll so that we have a nice flat piece. In this case, this is for reinforcing 3.9-inch airframe tube. So I'm only going to really need about 12.5 inches of length. So I already have more than enough exposed. And now I have that last toe on a nice clean straight edge. I have the fabric smoothed, relatively square. Doesn't need to be perfect, but the more care you take, the easier it'll be to work with when your hands are full of epoxy. So we know from basic geometry the circumference of a tube, but you can easily also measure it. We see that a 3.9-inch tube circumference is a little under 13 inches. We want a little extra to play with, so in my case I'm going to go for 13.5 inches. Okay, now what we're going to do is cut our 13.5-inch piece off the end. I'm actually going to laminate 2 tubes, so I'm going to need a 26.5-inch piece and plus an inch or so, and a 16-inch piece also plus an inch. So what I'm going to do first is cut the piece off the end and then divide it into the 2 pieces that I actually want. So when I measure the length, I want to measure from the last toe I pulled. You'll have a little extra fabric along the edge, which is fine, because what will happen is if the toe is too close to the edge of the fiber when you're working with it, the toes will start coming off. If you have too much excess, you can cut off the little bits and, to make a smoother edge, but here, varying between 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch of extra toe is fine. So what I'm going to do is measure my 13.5 inches at both ends. Again, I'm measuring from the last toe. Okay, so I now have a cut that's going to be more or less across, even with a couple of fibers. Now you're never going to get it perfect. You're going to cut across some fibers, which is part of the reason you want extra, because you can clean it up later. But get as close as you can and it'll be as easy to work with. The magic for cutting cloth, and this works for fiberglass, it also works for carbon fiber, won't work for Kevlar, is a rolling cutter. When you're working by yourself, an extra hand can often be very helpful, so I'm just going to clamp this end of the rule down. So again, rolling cutter, these are sold at fabric stores. You can get them at Michael's or any fabric store. They're great for cutting. This is the magic. So what I'm going to do here is just run the rolling cutter along the rule and it will cut it. If I apply firm, consistent pressure, it will cut every strand and I'll be done in one pass. One thing to be careful of is if you release pressure and put down, you will end up having a few strands not cut, so you have to be very careful when you separate the fabric so that you don't pull the individual toes. So, to use the rolling cutter, firm, consistent pressure. And we have the cut. So once we have the cut made, we want to separate the 2 pieces. Now what will happen is, because I had to move along, I may have released pressure on some parts, and so there may be some toes that are not completely cut. So I want to be very careful when I peel this back and make sure, see, here it's pretty good. In fact, it looks like I got all the way across. Okay, great. So now I've got 2 pieces, and they're cut pretty close to across one toe, one strand. But what I will do again here is to clean up the edge by pulling loose toes. And this isn't critical, but it does make it a little easier to deal with the fabric later. Although this part I'm just going to turn around and roll up again anyway. Okay, I groomed this edge a little bit, removing the fragments that got left from toes that weren't perfectly straight. Now I'm going to mark the lengths that I want. So we'll start with the first one, 27 and a half. So I'll mark one fiber. Now we're going to do a little trick to get a straight line across here. This actually comes from sewing. So if you have or know anybody who does sewing as a hobby, this is a trick that I learned actually from Becky Green. So I'm going to pull one string out like that. Now I have a mark that's exactly aligned with the fabric. So when I go through and cut with the rolling cutter, I can cut right to the mark. And in this case, I know exactly that I'm going to be along with the toes. I'm not going to cross any toes because I have this missing toe that I can cut to. Again, steady pressure. Doesn't have to be hard, firm enough to cut. This is only 4-ounce fabric, so I'm not doing a huge amount of work. But in any case, the rolling cutters are very sharp. Again, peel back the gap, make sure I don't have any uncut fibers. I don't. Looks good. Lay this over. Now, you'll notice when I pull this end toe, one toe comes all the way across. So I got it perfect in this cut. I'm going to pull 2 toes just because towards the edge it's easy to fray. So now I have my cut piece of fabric ready to be used for whatever I need.